Thank you for coming. My name is Paul Gould, and I teach philosophy here in apologetics at the seminary. And I'll apologize to, there's some students from the class that we're actually talking about these topics all semester, so you guys are probably already tired of hearing this, but there'll be some crossover there. And also, some of what I want to begin with, you've heard if you've been around for a little bit. I want to share a personal story from a movie to get us going here. And so some of you have already heard this, I know that, but sorry for those who haven't. So, all right. Well, let me begin. So earlier, I guess last year, my wife and I went on a date. And, you know, we do what you do often, especially when you're not very creative. And we went out to dinner, and then we were going to go out to a movie. And that night, it was my wife's turn to choose. And so we ended up at a movie I probably would not have gone to. There's no guns in there or whatever. But we went to La La Land. And if you've seen this movie, how many people have seen La La Land? Okay, good. A lot of you, most of you. So you know in the story, you have Emma Stone's character, Mia. And, you know, in the first part of the story, she's an aspiring actress, and she's doing everything she can to basically make it in the movie industry. And she's trying out and auditioning for show after show, and she just doesn't make it. And she begins to have this suspicion that she's never going to make it, and she's never going to measure up and make it in Hollywood. And then as the story progresses, you have this scene where her boyfriend, Sebastian, who's also an aspiring musician, a jazz artist, coaxes her into one final audition. She's just about to give up on her dream. And he says, well, why don't you go do this one last audition? And so she agrees to do it. And so she goes into this last audition with basically a sense of abandonment. There's sprinkled with a little hope there. She walks into the room. If you guys know the scene, two casting agents are sitting there, and they ask her to tell them a story. Tell them a story. She thinks for a minute, a smile curls on her lips, and then she begins to sing this beautiful song called An Ode to Dreamers. And in there, she sings of her aunt, who lived in Paris, who inspired her to become an actress. And I can remember Ethel and I sitting in the movie theater, and there is something about the intensity of the moment, the rawness of the moment, the beauty of the moment that caused us to do what anybody would do in that situation, which was we bawled, we cried. We sat there in the movie theater and we were basically, totally in tears. And let me give you the context, though. There's actually a context to the whole thing that helps you understand that. Earlier that night at dinner, Ethel and I had been talking about our dreams. And Ethel, my wife, had for years longed to write fiction. And so we were talking about that. And she wants to write fiction that is not crass, not preachy, but it's sort of something that evokes the beauty of the divine and the gospel in a way that's subtle and it's suggestive and things like that. Kind of like a Wendell Berry or a Flannery O'Connor or even a Marilyn Robinson, if you know some of these authors. That's the types of authors that she would love to aspire to. And so we were talking there, and for years, Ethel, my wife, we'd just been too busy. She's been too busy to sort of pursue that dream. We homeschooled our 4 kids, and she was involved there. We were involved in ministry. And then for years, she was supporting me as I was pursuing higher education, first in seminary, then at Purdue with the PhD. She just didn't have time to pursue that part of the dream that God had in her life. Finally, though, we're all kind of settled. I'm happily teaching here. And about 2 years ago, we all agreed that this is Ethel's time to pursue her dream. And so as a family, we all, Ethel enrolled in some writing classes. And actually, she enrolled in one. And she enrolled in it, and she began this class. And it was everything that we would have hoped for her. She was affirmed in her gifting for writing. She was encouraged to pursue writing as a vocation, and all of the things that we could have hoped. And so now Ethel is enrolled in a program, learning how to write. But that night, right before the movie, she shared, though, her insecurity. What if I'm never good enough? What if I'm not smart enough? What if I'm not creative enough and I'll just be passed over? Okay, so that was the part of the context. Also, I shared my own dreams and aspirations. We talked about myself, and we laughed about my grandfather and my grandmother on my dad's side, who were actors. And I knew them. They were in Hollywood all of my life. My grandmother was a musician, my grandfather was an actor, and we laughed about how I know so very little about their lives. And only recently, in the last decade or so, as I've come to learn more about my grandfather, I've come to learn a little bit more about who I am and my own identity. And just to give you an idea, so my grandfather's name was Gould, and that's what I knew him as. But when he died, I was looking through all his paperwork and his awards and different things that he left behind, and he died in my late 20s. And I came across his birth certificate, and his birth certificate said Zelig Goldfader. And I'm like, hey, Dad, why does Grandpa have this name on his birth certificate? And so here I am, think about this, late 20s, and I come to realize that I learned for the first time that my grandfather was 100% Jewish. I'm like, oh, well, this is interesting, tell me more. You'd think you would have these kind of discussions in a family, but we didn't. Learned that my grandfather emigrated, well, actually his family emigrated from Russia in 1912, and he was born shortly thereafter in Massachusetts. And then at 16, he ran away from home to go to Hollywood to become an actor. And if you know anything, if you can kind of add the time frame, if you know anything about Hollywood in the 1920s and 1930s, this was a time in our country where anti-Semitism was rife, and especially in Hollywood. So you can imagine an aspiring young actor named Zelig Goldfader trying to make his way in Hollywood. So he changed his name, actually his stage name at first, to Gould. That was how I knew him. So imagine the situation. Here I am, late 20s, and suddenly I learn that I'm Jewish. Awesome, I'm part of the chosen. I mean, it was kind of a mind-blowing thing. This is why I look like the way I look. I've always wondered, people, what are you, Greek? Are you Armenian? I don't think so. I'm Jewish. And so we learned these things. I also learned more in recent years about his career. I learned that early on, I've got a picture. Actually, I'll ask you guys. No one's seen this one. He acted at vaudeville with Mae West. That's Mae West there in London and then in New York. Now, anybody know which one's my grandfather? You pick him out? Looks a lot like me. Any guesses? This guy? That's my grandfather. So this is Gould right here. So I'm learning these things about him, that he acted in vaudeville with Mae West and all these sort of, at the time, the elites in the industry. During the war and right after the war, he would entertain troops with Bob Hope all over Europe in the airlift that took place in the 46 and 47. And then in the 50s, this is kind of interesting, in the 1950s and 60s, I've started to do some research on him. For about a decade, and again, you got to understand the context. Right now we advertise, or companies advertise on social media and on TV. But back then, you advertised on radio and TV as well. And then also, my grandfather was a spokesperson for Quaker Oats. And for about a decade of his life, he would dress up in Quaker Oats garb, and he spoke to over almost 1 million high school students all over the country on actually patriotism and democracy, and then Quaker Oats. And he did it dressed up, there he is, like your Quaker. So I learned about these things. He had bit roles in movies and TV and things like that. And we still get movies because he's a part of the guild there, and so we get all these free movies that go to my parents' house every year, and I steal them and bring them home. But so that night, as we were talking, so this was a conversation Ethel and I were having about me, and the question that sort of was surfaced in my life was, well, why did I not become an artist? And I began to wonder, is there some part of me that's artistic or that has this passion for art that's just waiting to burst out? And so this was kind of the context to the tearful moment that took place, a little bit later there in the movie theater. Okay, so that's the backstory. And the reality was, as we sat there in that movie watching La La Land, and specifically watching that scene, that story and that song unmasked us. For Ethel, all that emotion, all that insecurity was raised to the surface with the beauty of that song and that scene. For me, I'm not as in touch with my feelings, but I cried for some reason, because art does that, right? Beauty moves us. And of course, stories do that as well. And it was interesting. I can remember driving home that night with her. We were both just kind of laughing, like, what just happened in that movie theater? But we both concluded that the power of story and the power of art and the power of beauty to move is something that we should explore. We should think about a little bit more. And so that's the context, actually, for what I want to talk to you about tonight, is this totally underutilized aspect, I think, of the opportunity that we have in evangelism and in apologetics to incorporate beauty and art and the imagination as we build a bridge to the gospel. Okay? So my thesis tonight, you've got a handout, but we're going to kind of do for a little bit here, we're just going to do a little, tour through this concept of beauty. We're going to look at sort of the history of the concept, or we'll ask the question, what is beauty? And then we're going to see how we can apply it actually in apologetics. And then we'll hopefully have time for questions. So I have a thesis. The thesis is that God can use beauty to awaken longing, and specifically our longing for home. And what I mean by that is heaven, the thing that we were made for, union with God. And therefore we should incorporate beauty into our apologetics. Okay? There's the thesis. Let me sort of unpack that. But before we do that, we do need to take, just sort of pause and talk about the fact that I think largely as Christians we're confused about the nature of beauty. And we're confused in at least 3 ways. And these are important to sort of mention so that we can identify them and then set them aside. The first way that we're confused is because of anti-intellectualism. In other words, we just don't have a theology of beauty. How many people have even thought or realized that there is a deep theology of beauty? Or even, what beauty actually is? The reality is, as we'll get to in a minute, beauty is an objective feature of reality. It's an objective feature of the world. But because of the Enlightenment and sort of the intellectual mood that we find ourselves in, matters of beauty are relegated to the realm of the subjective personal preference, right? So you like Brussels sprouts, I like Twinkies, whatever. They're personal preferences. You like Van Gogh, I like Van Halen, things like that. They're just personal preferences, and that's kind of where we are. But by and large, Christians have followed suit with this anti-intellectualism, especially when it comes to aesthetic facts like beauty. And so we don't have a theology of beauty, okay? So that's one of the reasons why, and I guess I should say more, beauty is an exile in the church in this way. We don't know what to do with it. Or we're either ambivalent to it or we have outright disdain for it, right? And so that's what I want to first address. That's why it's an exile. And by the way, our culture is very aware of beauty, and often beauty is held captive in our culture, and it's used to manipulate us and to fleece our wallets as well, often. Okay, so the first reason, anti-intellectualism. Second reason why beauty is an exile in the church is pragmatism. As a church, I think, as evangelicals, our mind has been trained to prefer the pragmatic over the beautiful, and so we seek programs and strategies and policies and so on that have immediate results. And so what happens is we forget that truth, we focus rightly on truth, I would say, and we argue for our position, and we focus rightly on morality and living the good life, but what we forget is that you can tell the truth in an ugly way. And that you could live a good life, but you can fail to hear the music of the gospel, the beauty of the gospel, right? Goodness, truth, and beauty are integrated and tightly integrated. But because of this pragmatic impulse, we tend to deride art and beauty as something that can be used, usually for propaganda, but not something that should be curated and cultivated, right? Third reason why we're suspicious, I think, in general, in the church is because of it's called Philistinism. But the idea, and you guys can recognize the idea even if you don't know the word, think of a momentary glance at much of the modern art that we see. Thinking of going, down to the Modern Art Museum maybe. But not just that, we'll think of music, painting, sculptures, dance, literature, film. We rightly critique the perversity that we find there, right? Whether it's sexual perversity or gore or things like that. And of course, desiring to remain pure, right? That's our call as Christians. And in that desire, we often shun all forms of art with the same broad stroke as corrosive, right? So we don't have nuance. We don't have any place for nuance. But here's the thing. In the quest for purity, oddly enough, we begin to look at the world the same way everybody else does. And how does everybody else look at the world? We look at it as mundane. We look at it as ordinary. We look at it as everyday instead of deeply beautiful and deeply mysterious. Okay? So, anyway, these things need to go. That's the first thing I want to say. We need to reject anti-intellectualism and have a theology of beauty. We need to reject pragmatism and incorporate beauty into our lives, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute. And then just to have a more nuanced view here, that God can actually use beauty. All right, so let's talk. My goal, I think, is to do three things. Because I want to have time for questions, I'm just going to ask and answer three questions myself, and then I'll close it. And then we'll. So I'm not going to get through everything on the handout, but I'm happy to keep talking about things that if you wonder, why did you talk about, or have that on the handout but not talk about it? We can do that. But I just want to ask the questions, what is beauty? And then the other two there, what is the role and function of beauty? And then how can we incorporate it into art, and how can we incorporate art, beauty, and the imagination in apologetics? Okay? So let's start with this question, what is beauty? And what I want to do, if that's okay, is I want to give you a brief survey through the history of ideas on this concept of beauty. Because what's interesting is if you do it, you see a common thread throughout all of the thinking on that. And actually, before we get to Plato, you guys, those of you know who this is, right? This is Plato. Before we get there, let me just say two things. And I already said it, but I want to just double click on this. Beauty is an objective feature in the world, right? So we recognize physical facts. We recognize that this is a podium here. That's a physical fact about this world. We also recognize moral facts, right? I don't think we would argue that honesty is a virtue. That's a fact that's part of the fabric of this world. Torturing babies for fun is wrong. That's a fact, right? It's a moral fact. Just like there's physical facts, there's moral facts. Let me just add to that, though. There's also aesthetic facts, okay? Aesthetic, that's the name of beauty. There's facts about physical beauty. There's facts about, it could be a mathematical formula that has a certain kind of elegance, and so on. So the point is, beauty is an objective feature of the world. Okay, if you're in my class, don't answer this. So here's the thing. Who here thinks beauty is in the eye of the beholder? You guys have heard this phrase, right? Oh, everybody feels like it's a setup. It's not a setup. Okay, so if beauty is an objective feature of the world, then it's not the case that beauty is merely in the eye of the beholder, okay? So think about that. We behold beauty with our eyes, but it's not like we just make up beauty by personal preference, right? It's an objective feature. Now, okay, so what is an aesthetic fact? Well, an aesthetic fact is something, it's an intrinsically valuable state of affairs and that obtains in our world. Okay, so morality and beauty are objective values that exist in the world. And actually, philosophers usually talk about three kinds of objective values: goodness, truth, and beauty. So truth is studied in the philosophical discipline called epistemology. Goodness is studied in the discipline called ethics. And then beauty is studied in the discipline called aesthetics. So these are values, okay, objective values. Okay, with that, though, let's look at what the history says here. So this is Plato. Just to give you a time frame, Plato lived he was born in 427 BC. He died 347 BC, so long time ago. On your handout, so Plato distinguished between beautiful things and beauty itself. So here's a quote from the Republic. Let's look at this. He says, "What about someone who believes in beautiful things but doesn't believe in the beauty in the beautiful itself, and isn't able to follow anyone who could lead him to the knowledge of it? Don't you think he is living in a dream rather than a weakened state?" And then Socrates' reply, "I certainly think that someone who does that is dreaming." So something to notice here, the distinction, pretty basic, between beautiful things and beauty itself. And then the conclusion here, Socrates basically agreeing with the sentiment that if you can't make that distinction, you're not living in reality. And in the Platonic epistemology, dreams are like the lowest form of knowledge. It's a very weak, it's a bad state of affairs. Okay? So that's Plato. Let's fast forward about 800 years to Augustine. So Augustine he was born in 354 AD, died 430 AD. And Augustine took a lot of the Platonic thought and baptized it within Christian theology. And so if you read Augustine's Confessions, you find one of my favorite quotes in Book 3. And here it is. He's speaking of God, and he says of God the Father, "You are the beauty of all things beautiful." Do you hear the Platonic insight there? But look at how, when we take it and infuse it with theology, now instead of just beauty itself, beauty finds a source in God. Okay? And actually in the same passage he says, "You are the good of all good things." And then I would just add, "He is the truth to which all true things point." But here he says, you are the beauty of all beautiful things. Okay, so that's Augustine. Let's fast forward to another important church father. This is Aquinas. So now we're about another 800 years. Aquinas, 1224 BC, AD to 1274 AD. Now, Aquinas, he gives a definition on your handout. I'll give for Aquinas, beauty is a complex universal apprehended in beautiful things. Okay, what does that mean? What does all that mean? Well, let's look at what he says. This is in the Summa Theologian. He gives three characteristics. This is why I mean a complex property. Just think it's a complex thing. Beauty includes three things: integrity or perfection, since those things which are impaired are by that very fact ugly; due proportion or harmony; and lastly, brightness or clarity, whence things are called beautiful which have a bright color. Okay, so this is interesting. Three characteristics. So he says something is beautiful if it has three qualities. So what's that first one? Integrity or perfection? We could use the word wholeness. That would be probably more familiar for us. Something is whole when it's all put together, right? When nothing is missing, nothing is extra. And so wholeness, the phenomenology or the feeling of wholeness, it creates a kind of rest. Things are as they ought to be. That's wholeness. So beauty, one of the properties of this complex property of beauty is that it fits together and it gives a kind of settledness to us. Proportion, what's the second thing here? Proportion or harmony. Harmony is a good word there. So wholeness and harmony. Harmony, every part brings out the best of every other part. That's harmony. And when harmony obtains, think about it in music. What does it produce? Joy, right? The joy of community, the joy of unity. So there's harmony and there's wholeness. What about this third one? This third one's a little odd. Radiance, clarity, brightness. Beautiful objects communicate to us. They call us, and they communicate something profound. So it's interesting. What Aquinas is noting here is that our experience of beauty feels like a personal communication. And in fact, the Greek root for beauty comes from this word kalen, K-A-L-E-N, which means to call. Beauty calls. It's communicating something to us. Here's what Roger Scruton said. He wrote a book called Beauty, a very short introduction. And he said, beauty demands to be noticed, to speak to us directly like the voice of an intimate friend. Okay, so we've got Plato, we've got Augustine, and now we've got Aquinas. And they're basically zeroing in on the same kind of concept here. Let me give you one more here on our tour. Let's fast forward a little bit to this guy. So we got Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan Edwards, now we're in the 18th century, so 1703 to 1758. For Edwards, beauty was, let's see, what do I have on your handout here? Yeah, it's a kind of virtue or excellence. Okay, it's interesting. He says true virtue is some kind of beauty or excellence. Now listen, it's interesting if you hook up the four that we've looked at. It primarily consists in a propensity and union of the heart to capital B, being itself. So what's the capital B being for Edwards? God, yeah. So notice the hookup. We have, and so he makes, actually Edwards makes a distinction between two kinds of beauty. He calls them primary beauty and secondary beauty. Secondary beauty would be physical beauty, but it also includes things like mathematical laws or things that could be beautiful in that second sense. But all of those point to primary beauty, which for him was a union with God. And so when we love God and that which he has made, for Edwards, that's beautiful because you're in union with beauty itself. Do you see how the four thinkers actually hook up pretty nicely to give us a picture, I think, of what beauty is? Okay, so we could say a lot more, but maybe that'll give you a little, and we can talk about that some more. But let's move on. If what these thinkers say gives us some insight into what beauty is, well, then the question is, well, what is the role? What is the purpose of beauty? And here I want to say two things, and this is helping us move toward an apologetic of beauty. And let me just say it very simply. Here's two things that beauty does. Number one, it awakens, and number two, it transports us. Okay? How does it awaken? Remember what's interesting, this idea of beauty calling. What is it awakening in us? Well, it's awakening in us our longing for home, our longing for God, our longing to be united with that which is whole and proportional, and that is inviting us to join Him, which is union with God. And how does it transport us? Well, here's an interesting idea. So these pictures up here are pictures of the siege of Leningrad in World War II. And if you know anything about this, the siege here, it was horrific. Leningrad was under siege for over a year. People were dying of starvation. There was cannibalism. There was just horrific things that took place to survive. But interestingly, in that, there was a composer, a guy named Dmitri Shostakovich, who does anybody know this Russian composer? Yeah, so he composed, during the siege, he was composing a symphony. And in fact, even as the bombs were falling, he was up on his piano writing the symphony. And they eventually, with this orchestra, literally that some of them were dying of starvation during practice because it was so horrific, they performed this symphony. And it was the thing that sustained the city. What is interesting is those who chose to join together in community for the cause of beauty actually were sustained through the siege. And those who separated themselves didn't. But in this book, so there's a book called by a guy named M.T. Anderson called Symphony for the City of the Dead. I highly recommend it to you. It's actually a children's book, but it's a great book for like a 12, 13, 14-year-old, I think, genre. But it's really, really powerful book. But in there, we read of what this idea of how beauty transports us. We read of a scene where the city was under siege, and everybody had run to a bomb shelter, and in that bomb shelter, somebody picked up a violin and began to play. And here's the quote. So this man picks up the violin during the siege, and he begins to play. And this is out of somebody's diary. So this is the actual person as they experienced it. There are explosions all around us, and he is playing the violin as if he is leading us to safety. To hear the transporting us to another place. The terror was somehow less powerful. It had lost its grip on us. It was outside us now, and inside we had our music, and everyone felt its power. So notice in the primary world, wait, sorry. Okay, so in the primary world, these people were confronted with bombs and just horrific, things, corpses, blood, everything. But as the music played, they're transported to another place where things are as they should be. Remember that the settledness, the rest of the wholeness of beauty? Well, that's what it does. Beauty reminded them of their humanity, and it actually sustained them through their darkest time. And so it's interesting, C.S. Lewis, in The Problem of Pain, there's this famous quote, you guys probably are familiar with it, where he says that pain is God's megaphone to rouse a deaf world. You know this quote? Well, I would want to add to what Lewis says there, and beauty is a megaphone to rouse what I would want to call a disenchanted world, right? That we live in this world that doesn't see reality the way it actually is. And we need to be reawoken to the fact that this world is not mundane. This world is not ordinary. This world is actually beautiful, and it's, to use the right word, it's sacred. It's gift, and it's meant to be a signpost to point us to God. And so beauty is that megaphone. And in fact, I would draw it, but that would take too much work. Peter Kraft, who's a philosopher, he talks about 3 prophets of the human soul that God has given us. And the 3 prophets are our minds, reason, our conscience, and then our imagination. And so God has given us intellectuals, philosophers, scientists, historians to guide us with reason. God's given us prophets and moralists and lawyers to guide us with the conscience. And God has given us storytellers and artists and painters and dancers and writers to help us with beauty. And what's interesting, each of these prophets of the soul is on a quest for the object of their longing. And so you can kind of tie this all together. Hopefully you see this. What does reason long for? Remember our 3 values? Truth. What does the conscience long for? Goodness. And what do you think the imagination is on a quest for? Beauty. Now think of the four things that we just read about from Plato, Augustine, Aquinas, and Edwards. What is the source of goodness, truth, and beauty found? Where is it found? In Christ. So if we can awaken the longing for beauty with the help of the imagination, we're leading them on the journey to Christ. And actually, I'd say the same for reason and the conscience as well. Okay, so that's actually what I'm thinking here when I think about this question of how do we use beauty. All right, I don't even know when we end. Let me just say some more things and we'll be done and we can take some questions. How about that third question? What is the connection between beauty, art, and apologetics? Quickly, let me just give you a couple here. Actually, let me share from you these three questions that come from an article by Tim Keller that I can point you to. I've got it in my bag, actually, but I highly recommend it, where he's looking at the tabernacle and God's command to Moses to build the tabernacle, and Keller's examining that, and this is where God calls these artists by name to build the tabernacle, and then Keller asks three questions, and let me just sort of wrap this up with these questions, and we can have some time to discuss this. But the first question Keller asks, he notices that we have artists, in Israel in this case had artists. You wouldn't think they would because they're just coming out of the Exodus. And of course we have artists today too. And so he asks this question, why do we have artists? Why do we have them? And this is what Keller says. He says we have artists because they reveal something about the greater reality in an indefinable and inescapable way. And then he says that artists help us to see reality in a way that we can't see it. They peel back the mundane, and it's as if they peel back the curtain of the mundane and they have a peek at reality as it actually is. So why do we have them? Because we need them. Because they see reality as beautiful and sacred. So next question he asks, why do we need artists? So we have them, but why do we need them? His answer is kind of multi-layered, but he says this. Artists help us to see and understand truth, and in seeing and understanding truth, to enjoy it, and in seeing and understanding and enjoying truth, to worship that who is the source of truth, the source of all, which is God himself. Here, let me just read two quotes. Here's one about the church that Tim Keller says in this article. He says, the church needs artists to assist the body in understanding truth, but just as importantly, the church needs artists to equip the church to praise God. We cannot praise God without art. And then he says this, and this is provocative. Further, without art, we can't reach the world. I hope you hear that. Without art, we can't reach the world. The simple fact is the imagination gets you, even when your reason is completely against the idea of God. Later on, he says, there's a sort of schizophrenia that occurs if you're listening to Bach, and you hear the glory of God, yet your mind says there is no God, right? So beauty awakens this thing, and now you try to bring wholeness to it. And so this is an aspect, what I'm suggesting to you, that we can use. And in fact, Keller says we need to use it to present the gospel. All right, last question here. How can we be an artist? And here, Keller's answer in the articles is fine. He basically says, do it in community and do what God has called you to do. And that's, of course, a fine answer. But I want to just press a little bit deeper here as I sort of close up this idea. There's a book by a guy named Andy Crouch called Culture Making. And in there, he says that as humans created in the image of God, we are created in the image of a God who creates and cultivates. So part of what it means to be created in the image of God is that we, like God, are sub-creators and cultivators, right? That we are also called to be creators and cultivators of the good, the true, and the beautiful, and everything that the soul is meant to be nourished on. And so, and he says that we're makers of things. We're makers of stuff, and then we're makers of meaning. And so I guess the first thing I would want to say in answering this question, how can you be an artist, is just to bring beauty back into your life, and to bring it back into the church, and to bring it back into your evangelism and your apologetics. And so I guess the way I'd like to say it is, whether it's an omelet, or an outfit, or a sermon, or a bridge, or a building, or a tweet, or a PowerPoint, although this isn't a great example, but a research paper for the students here, a movie review, an Amazon review, a landscape, whatever it is, bring beauty into your life. And I guess resist that temptation. I don't know if you noticed earlier I had those buildings of the church buildings up there. Resist the temptation to be purely pragmatic and focus on utility only. We need, think of this room. This is a very drab room. But wouldn't our experience of this space be completely different if we were sitting in something that had actual texture and beauty? I think we would. I think we know that. Okay, so bring beauty into our life. That's the first thing. Second thing I want to say is just to realize that the most beautiful thing that we can all do is locate our life in the great story of God, which is the gospel, right? Find your meaning in that true story of the world, the story that is alive and inviting, and then, of course, invite others to do the same. And so here, let me end with this part here. So there's this book by Dostoevsky called The Idiot. Has anybody read this? It's a long, hard book. One of the characters in there says something really provocative. He says this: beauty will save the world. Remember when I heard that quote, I'm like, beauty will save the world? What do you mean by that? I mean, give me money, okay, fine. Give me power, give me military might, but beauty? How will beauty save the world? But the more I think about it, the more I've studied this, the more I've thought theologically about this, the more that, sorry, I thought that was me. The more that I've thought about this, there is a sense in which beauty will save the world, right? What does Augustine say? Jesus, you are the beauty of all beautiful things. So where do we find beauty ultimately? We find it in Christ. And of course, Christ is the person that is the Savior of the world. So there is a sense in which this quote is correct, because beauty is found in a person. And so my challenge to you then is to think of beauty this way. Beauty calls, and the imagination guides, right? And they're guiding us on our way home. All right, so when I stop there, I don't know, we have 10, 15 minutes. And what do you guys want to, any questions? What do you guys want to talk about? Yeah, go ahead there, and then Brian after that. Yeah. What do you mean? Yeah. 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 Okay. It's a good question. I don't know if I have a super great answer to that. I would just want to say a couple things. It is true that beauty is a degreed property, right? So think of beauty as a scale. There's, on one side, we might want to say there's sacred beauty, the source of beauty itself, God. And then, you kind of go down to even something called everyday beauty. I mean, there is actually a beauty in this room. I'm talking about the room itself, because there's a kind of structure to it. But it's down at the lower end of the beauty scale, right? And so that's one thing I'd want to say is, okay, it's already a little complicated there, number one. And number two, there is, within that scale, there is some, I do think that there is a role for preference, and I think that's part of your question, right? It could just be that I like this piece of art and you just won't, and that's fine. But we can still acknowledge that there's beauty in that piece, and that's what I'm trying to get at. And I also think that all art is not, there can be art that's ugly and that still has a purpose. And that, even if there's not beauty embodied in it. So, yeah, I don't know. I just think keep talking about it. I don't know what the good answer is to that. Brian?
What was you allowed to be vulgar? I mean, like, the glass of, you remember the
yeah.
glass, I mean, why, how can anybody consider that beauty? I mean, that's what it was.
Yeah. You need to read Nancy Pearcey's book called Saving Leonardo, which some in the class are reading, where it kind of gives through it gives a tale about how we got there. And the point that Nancy makes in the book Saving Leonardo is that art embodies our worldview. And so when you get to the urinal as a piece of art, that's modern art, what that's doing is expressing the worldview of the artist in that case. And there's a kind of nihilism that's going on behind that expression. There is no meaning, there is no beauty in the world, and so beauty is whatever, and so there's a kind of shock value to that actually too. They're trying to shock you. And that's, so I would look at modern art, just like you'd look at any piece of art, as expressing the worldview, the time, and the artist, and things like that. Well, I mean, it expresses where that artist was at, perhaps, or where the culture was at that time. Yeah. Jim, and then in the back. So Jim, yeah.
Something you said very like
Yeah, I think it's interesting in Scripture when you see. I mean, it's very clear. Like I'm thinking of Exodus 31, anytime you see language about craft or craftsmen, or even handiwork, which is when we speak of God, even in Romans 1 and then in Ephesians 2, where it talks about God's handiwork, and it even says we are God's handiwork. So I think it's, for me, what I think is a spiritual discipline is this. There's two ways of perceiving that are going on in the world right now. There's one way, which is, I use the word disenchanted. And that's what I mean by that is that we reduce the world and those in it to commodities, and we don't see them for what they actually are. So a disenchanted perceiving is a kind of perception where we fail to see the world in its proper light. And that, actually, theologians talk about this, and it's a kind of idolatrous perception. Because if we perceive the world as mundane and ordinary in every way, we're actually not perceiving the world the way it is. Now, if you look at the Gospels and say, well, how did Jesus perceive the world? Well, he viewed the world as God-bathed and just God-infused. There's a beautiful world where God is fully present. And so the idea of re-enchanting, or a kind of re-enchanted, or actually the word is a sacramental perception of the world, is what I would say is the discipline. So how do we begin to view the world the way Jesus does, is the question I would do. And so I would say begin to resurrect wonder in your life. Begin to ask God to help you see the world the way that it actually is, and that includes that. So in this class that I'm teaching, we talk about rebaptizing the imagination, like that we even in the kinds of things that we consume in our life, and even the spaces we inhabit, they kind of at the level of our bones or our gut, it gives us a way of viewing the world that's very disenchanted. And so we just read this story this week by J.R. Tolkien, and we read this essay called The Essay on Fairy Stories, where he says that he was talking about fairy stories, and he said that we need to escape into fairy stories, and that's kind of an heroic escape, because there we get recovery, and then we get consolation, and then we return back to the primary world with fresh eyes. And so imagination and beauty is actually a kind of recovery. And actually church is supposed to be that too. It's not always, but it's supposed to be a place where we escape, have recovery, consolation, and then we see the world again. So I think the discipline is beginning to see the world the way Jesus does. Dallas Willard, chapter 3 in The Divine Conspiracy, I think is a really important chapter on that idea of how to re-enchant and see the world the way Jesus does, if that helps a little bit. Back there, and then Josh. Yeah, I'd just say false dichotomy. It's not an either or, it's a both and. So Plato talks about three kinds of values. Something that's valuable in and of itself, something's valuable for what it brings, and something that's both valuable in and of itself and for what it brings. I want to say beauty is of the third kind. Does that make sense? So beauty is valuable in and of itself, because it's intrinsically valuable and good and pleasurable. But it's also valuable in terms of what it does, the purpose of it, which is, I think, to put us on a journey toward God. And so that's how I would unite them. And I would say with logic and rhetoric, properly understood, that's the same thing. I mean, think of the trivium, the classical education. You have grammar, logic, rhetoric, are the first three of the trivium, then you have the quadrivium. The trivium are, what do they call them? The ways of language. Via, way, the three ways of language. And grammar is bringing coherence to your sentence, to your thought. And logic is bringing coherence to your mind. And rhetoric, properly, classically understood in the Christian tradition, is bringing unity to the community. That's the purpose of rhetoric. And so there's actually, when you properly understand those terms, that's classically what those were. And so what is the purpose of the trivium and then the four ways of mathematics, which would have been geometry, astronomy, oh, help me here, it's late, two others. Those form the seven liberal arts, called the seven liberating arts. And then you studied theology, classically, and then you studied philosophy, the handmaiden of the queen of the science, which was theology. And so to me, that's the, and so why do we do that? Because we were made to be nourished on goodness, truth, and beauty. So I don't see any dichotomy the way that I'm thinking of this, and that's some of the reason why. Does that help a little bit, maybe? You could think about it. You'll have to, you can think about it. All right, yeah, I said a lot there, but Josh and then Josh.
You didn't say this necessarily on the first page. Basically, whatever you build for utility will very soon be useless, but whatever you build for beauty will last basically forever. And Roger Scruton makes the point that shared spaces should give the most consideration to beauty.
Yeah, that's good.
Shared in common and so forth. So my question is, what should be the line between utility and beauty when you're doing construction on a corporate project, like for example a church building?
Yeah.
How should you teach your people to weight those competing virtues? Because we don't have the money to do everything I'd like to do.
Yeah.
Or that anyone would like to do. So how do you teach people what is valuable and what balance we should strike there? Because I'm for going hog wild, and other people are like, no.
Yeah. Are you guys doing a building campaign right now?
Well,
You're headed?
yes and no.
Okay.
We just did some construction and sort of thing. So I'm looking for how to articulate that value system.
Oh man, that's a great question. Which I don't know. I mean, you have to teach them a theology of beauty and why this stuff matters. So push against the purely pragmatic mentality, because we are not mere machines, as Nancy was saying. We run on more than just utility. We run on beauty. That's actually how God made us. And so you've got to incorporate into your teaching, which trickles all the way down to your subcommittee on building your roof or whatever it is you're doing. That we're going to find some way, even if it's a small thing. I mean, we do have realities too, so you got to do the best of work within the reality you have. But even if you can do something small for the name of beauty,
I'm preaching on it and pushing on it.
Yeah, and that's great.
I just wonder
Yeah.
what you think the right balance is.
Oh, anything in the direction of beauty is heading in the right direction. I don't know when you hit that balance, but we've erred this way, so let's just start working our way that way. So, Joe.
So I was what you said about bulky, about the idea of the
Yeah. Uh-huh.
So I'm a student at the currently. So one of the things now is video games and that. So is there is there a limit to how beneficial fantasy can be in the form of how they're finding? Because obviously, I think of Tolkien's work, Lord of the Rings, is obviously filled with parallels of theological concepts.
Mm-hmm.
But in, for instance, if it's something like a sport game or something like Call of Duty, like where is the line where it stops becoming something that awakens?
Yeah.
For God, it becomes just escaping from reality.
Yeah. Not all escape is heroic. So Tolkien says fantasy is a kind of heroic escape. I think that there's false reenchantments happening as well as genuine reenchantments happening. And so again, I apologize to those of you who hear me speak here all the time on this, but Pokemon Go. Remember that a year ago? Hey, reality's not just the mundane. There's little Japanese creatures running around in reality somehow. That's and we loved it for 15 minutes that summer, That was a kind of, actually there's something instructive in that. Why did we get so excited about that? Well, there's partly because we long for the transcendence. And actually there's this book by a guy named Peter Berger called I think it was The Sacred Canopy. Actually, it might not have been that book, but Peter Berger, he writes about how there's the transcendence police. And it's kind of like they treat anything that has transcendence written on it like porn. That's actually the word he uses. And the reality police tell us that all of reality is down here in the mundane, yet we long for more. And so what you find are false reenchantments all over our culture. Why are we obsessed with the paranormal and the occult? Because it gives us a sense that there's something more to this world. To me, those are false reenchantments. Video games, they're a kind of false reenchantment because it's not like you're escaping into another world that gets you closer to reality. The world is right there. The fallen world and its structures are right there in that medium. And so I think it's instructive. And I mean, you play video games, whatever. I'm not anti-video games. But I'm saying if we escape to them thinking we're somehow going to obtain the actual longing of our heart, which is the one true transcendent reality, which is God, that's where it becomes a false reenchantment. And at that point, it becomes an idol that's an iron cage from which we can never get out of. But here's the way that I would say it. If we settle for the glimpse, there's glimpses everywhere, they become idols. But if we allow the glimpse to awaken us on our journey toward home, toward God, well then it's the function, it's fulfilling the function that it was meant to play. Does that help a little bit? So yeah, play your video games, but not all equal. Okay, last question because I don't want to keep you all guys too long. Yeah. That's right. Yeah. Yeah. But I'm glad you're here, though. Yes. Yeah. Yes. That's right. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And this is a challenge to me when I think about my own home. Do I have beauty in my house? Because I'm pretty, I paying the bills, right? Where do you spend $600 on a painting that you can't afford? That was your question, the way I interpret it. Yeah. So your home is absolutely a place where we can bring beauty, and even that we should strive for that. You said something else that I wanted to comment on, and I already forgot it. But thank you for your comment. Very good. Oh yeah, Eden. Absolutely. Look at Genesis 1 and the home. What do you find? Anytime you find shalom, you guys know the word, right? The Hebrew word, how the world is supposed to be. You find three things: beauty, order, and abundance. Right? That's what we're created. That's shalom. What do you find deeply written into the fabric of the physical universe? Beautiful laws of nature, order, and abundance. All right, let me say one announcement. I'm going to let you guys go. Thank you very much, though, for your time. I hope this was helpful. Okay, so tomorrow, we're doing something a little different in the morning. We start up at 9 o'clock in the morning, and we're actually beginning with breakout sessions. So you're not going to go to the main room. You're going to go to your breakout session. You guys, it looks like you're all looking at your schedule, so you can see this. Alan Hainline he's a lay scientist who's really involved in the debate over fine-tuning. Excellent speaker, and he really knows his science. And so if you're interested in fine-tuning and stuff like that, that would be Alan. Corey Miller, I saw in the back of the room right there. 6 generations removed from Joseph Smith's bodyguard, ex-Mormon. And he has got a book on Mormonism that just came out. Awesome guy. That's that one. And then Tim McGrew. I mean, this is tough choices for you. He's a professor of philosophy at Western Michigan, and he'll be teaching on miracles, which is he is an expert on the philosophy of this. And so you have 3 great choices at 9 o'clock, and then you can kind of follow the schedule from there. So 9 o'clock, find your room, and let me pray for you, and I'll let you guys out. Is that okay? All right, Lord, thank you for this night. Thank you that I know that this is just the beginning of the word on what beauty and its role in our life, but Lord, would you just set us on a journey to embrace everything that you are and everything that you've made so that we would be fully satisfied in you. Thank you for these men and women. I pray your blessing upon them tonight. In Jesus' name, amen.